Through the oceans of time, since the dawn of sailing vessels took to the oceans, there have been countless numbers of ships, from sailing ships, merchant ships, to warships, and everything in between. But of all these ships, there are few that stand out and can weather the oceans of time. Still fewer become household names, and still fewer are known by just about everyone on the planet. Few of these ships are known by name throughout the generations and locations throughout the world. Ships like the Bismarck, the Flying Dutchman, and perhaps the Edmund Fitzgerald join the ranks of the RMS Titanic as being mutually known and recognized throughout the world. In my opinion, you can add the HMS Bounty into that group. As much as the Titanic is known for tragedy and the Bismarck is known for strength, the Bounty is also known for one specific thing. That thing is mutiny. Mutiny against her acting captain. Mutiny led by the second in command. A mutiny which is really about two personalities rather than the crew itself. This is the story of a tired crew becoming tempted by the pleasures of the tropical islands. The story of egos becoming two personalities on board ship that clash. The acting captain, who is a Royal Navy Lieutenant William Bligh, and a second in command, which was Chief Officer at the time, Fletcher Christian. These two men were on a mission to secure a potential food source for the population of slaves. The rising costs of feeding them was cutting into the profits of the investors. An inexpensive food source was discovered as breadfruit. This supposedly tasted of fresh bread directly from the oven. Bligh would be given a ship called the Bounty to head to the tropics to secure this fruit, as well as bring back trees in order to plant new crops. The ship would never return. The crew, led by Mr. Christian, would set the acting Captain Bligh adrift with as many of his loyal followers as the tiny boat could hold. After an attempt at landing on an island, resulting in the death of the crewman, Bligh decided to head for an island of sanctuary over 3,600 miles away. Not only did that tiny boat make it, but Bligh himself would be marked as a hero upon his return to England. After telling his story, Bligh would be promoted to captain and leave with another vessel on the same mission. The crew that would be tracked down would bear the marks of treason. Some would be hanged, but all would go on to be known as the infamous crew of the HMS Bounty. William Bligh was 15 when he was first assigned to a sailing ship. He would go on to be a master navigator, a master marine surveyor, and a chart maker. Despite his skills, his ego would make him least popular among his fellow officers. In fact, while he served under Captain James Cook, he was so disliked by his peers that every officer under Cook's command would be promoted, with the exception of Bligh. Fletcher Christian was born in northern England on September 25, 1764. He would lose his father when he was only 4 years old. And as he grew, he would see the money his father left behind shrink until it was gone. That is when he decided to enlist in the Royal Navy in order to make a name for himself. At 19, he would enlist, and despite being considered old at the time, he would be successful. He would write to Lieutenant William Bligh, who was a friend of the family. Fletcher knew that he could help him further his sailing career. Bligh would help get him assigned to a merchant ship called the Britannia in 1786. Bligh would act as a type of father figure to Christian, especially since Fletcher lost his father at such a young age. After multiple trips aboard the Britannia, it would be Bligh himself who would recruit the young Fletcher to serve with him on a mission to the tropics aboard a ship called the Bounty. In 1787, investors in London were bracing for an anticipated economic catastrophe. In the West Indies, the rising costs of feeding the slaves that worked on the sugar plantations was threatening to create an instability in the economy, as well as the profit margins of the investors. Sir Joseph Banks, a botanist at the time, would propose a new, cheaper food source to the investors. He would plan an expedition to Tahiti in search of a fruit called breadfruit. This fruit would grow from the dampier tree and was explained to taste of oven fresh bread. Banks would be on a voyage under Captain Cook and was fond of the flavor of the fruits that he had sampled earlier. He knew that if he could get this crop to the West Indies, they would produce a new free food source to the slaves, thus increasing profits. Sir Joseph Banks would purchase a coal ship called the Bethia, and it would be this ship that would be refitted and relaunched as the HMS Bounty. To command his ship, Banks enlisted Lieutenant William Bligh to lead the expedition. Bligh would accept the assignment. However, he would be unable to persuade the Royal Navy brass to promote him to captain before leaving. So technically, he was still a lieutenant in the eyes of the Royal Navy. Banks knew that Bligh served under Captain Cook and was familiar with the tropical islands. And because Bligh was still a lieutenant, he was considerably cheaper to hire than a captain. After forming the rest of his crew, Bligh would hire Fletcher Christian as master's mate. In October of 1787, the Bounty would be fully crewed and stocked. The long journey from England to Tahiti awaited it. In an interesting little-known fact, while waiting for the Bounty to depart, Fletcher Christian would meet with his older brother, Charles. Charles Christian had returned on a merchant ship called the Middlesex. Incredibly, on his last voyage, he would participate in a mutiny on his last ship he served on. This would perhaps plant the seed in Fletcher's mind that mutiny would be a viable option against an unwanted captain. On December 23, 1787, the Bounty would receive her orders to depart. The journey to Tahiti started successfully. It was later revealed that Bligh wrote entries into the log only when it favored him or enhanced his command abilities. Lieutenant Bligh's true colors were exposed to the crew when it reported that 2 blocks of cheese were missing. Bligh angrily accused the crew of the theft. However, it would be crewman Henry Hill Brant that would remind the captain that the cheese was taken directly to Bligh's home along with some other provisions before they left England. Bligh angrily silenced him. Bligh would later substitute his crew's bread rations for rotting pumpkins, and it was around this point of the voyage that the crew began to realize that their acting captain did not have their best interests at heart. Bligh did praise the job that Fletcher Christian was doing, and on March 2nd, he would promote him to provisional lieutenant, making him the lead officer and second in command only to Bligh himself. As much as the crew began to distrust Bligh, they were very, very much respectful of Christian. On October 25th of 1788, the Bounty would finally arrive in Tahiti. The cold, tired crew would be introduced to the warm, food-rich island in Tahiti. Between the weather, the food, and the women, the crew quickly fell in love with their new surroundings. Fletcher Christian would be no exception. He would immerse himself in the island's culture. He would learn the language, mingle with the women, and he would even have the native tattooing done to himself. After nearly 5 months of island life, the first signs of the crew's desertion start to appear. On January 5th, 1789, 3 sailors would succumb to the island's trance. They would steal a lifeboat and desert the ship. The mutiny had begun. On April 4th, 1789, the Bounty would leave Tahiti. The ship would be fully stocked with the breadfruit and damper trees. The return to sea life was difficult for the sailors who had grown accustomed to the soft island life that they had grown so used to. Bligh knew that he would have to bring the crew back to the efficiency it had when it left England. In addition to the crew changing, Fletcher Christian himself had changed. Christian no longer looked up nor needed Bligh for guidance as he once did. Once the Bounty reached the Tongan Islands in April, Christian himself would lead a party in search of wood and fresh water. The party would return empty-handed, as they would be attacked by natives, and Bligh would accuse Christian and his crew of cowardice. Later, Bligh would accuse Christian of thievery over missing coconuts as well, and this would break, finally, Christian's obedience to Bligh. Christian would later attempt suicide. However, he would be talked out of it by master's mate George Stewart. And on the dawn of April 28, 1789, Fletcher Christian, along with about a dozen other men, would take the ship and place William Bligh on deck, bound with a sword at his heart. He would threaten to kill Bligh, but instead he would take the largest lifeboat on board Bounty and place Bligh in it. There were many crewmen that still supported Bligh. However, not all of them would fit into the boat. In fact, only 18 would go with him when they were set adrift. When Bligh and his crewmen tried to land on an island of Tofu, they were attacked and forced to retreat. Without having firearms, Bligh and his crewmen were vulnerable to stones and spears, and as a result, one crewman was killed. A Dutch colony on an island called Timor. Incredibly, with only a 5-day supply of food and water, Bligh would navigate the small boat 3,618 miles to safety. And on June 14th of 1789, after an excruciating 41 days adrift, the men would reach Timor. Bligh would go back to England and quickly tell his side of the story. It would make him sound like a hero. On October 22nd, 1790, the Royal Navy would exonerate Captain Bligh of all charges and promote him to captain. Later, he would make the rank of admiral. Meanwhile, the Bounty, now under the command of Fletcher Christian, is seeking a spot for the men to relocate and start their new lives. He reluctantly returned to Tahiti. Christian knows that this would be the first place that the Royal Navy would search for the deserters. Once there, the remaining crew decided to go on their separate ways. Some sail on with Christian and some remain on the island of Tahiti. Christian would then take the remaining men and sail the Bounty nearly 8,000 miles to settle on an island called Pitcairn. After being stripped of all useful items, the HMS Bounty would be set on fire, and her remains would sink to the bottom of the harbor. In 1791, almost a dozen men would be captured on Tahiti and returned to England to face charges. 6 men would be found guilty, and later 3 would be executed. They would be hanged on the HMS Brunswick on October 29, 1792. Later in 1960, a copy of the HMS Bounty would be built and launched. She would be the focal point in Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's movie Mutiny on the Bounty. Sadly, this Bounty would be lost as it would sink off the coast of North Carolina during Hurricane Sandy.